The Georgia sun had a cruel way of pressing down on Fort Benning. It didn't just shine. It punished. The morning heat baked the clay field until the air shimmered, and every breath felt like inhaling through sandpaper. Recruits slogged through the dust, sweat plastering their uniforms, boots pounding in rhythm with barked commands that cracked like whips. Sergeant Elena Cruz had been through worse climates, Afghanistan's deserts, Iraq's heat waves, but there was something different about Fort Benning's training yard. Here, the battle wasn't against the elements. It was against perception. She wasn't supposed to be there. At least, not in the eyes of some of the instructors. Elena was a decorated combat medic, with 2 tours behind her and scars etched across her skin like faded maps. She'd saved men twice her size under gunfire, pulled shrapnel from bodies while mortar screamed overhead. But in this environment, none of that mattered. Here she was the anomaly, the woman, the veteran with too much experience for their liking, the soldier whose presence turned their comfortable hierarchy upside down. The whispers had started on day 1. She'd caught fragments. Doesn't belong here. Show off. Thinks she's tougher than the men. It didn't bother her at first. Combat zones had taught her the art of selective hearing. Still, whispers have a way of growing sharp edges when they're repeated enough. This morning, the drills were relentless. Bayonet practice. Aggressive, messy, designed to test not only endurance, but willingness to tap into violence. Recruits screamed as they lunged at dummies, rifles tipped with dull blades slamming into sacks of sand and straw. Sweat soaked through fatigues, mixing with dirt until uniforms clung like second skin. Elena moved through the drill with calculated precision. Her strikes weren't the loudest or the most dramatic, but they were efficient, controlled bursts of energy, sharp thrusts that hit the target's weak points. A few recruits noticed, mimicking her rhythm. Others glared. The instructors noticed too. One in particular, Staff Sergeant Rollins, a thick-necked man with a voice like gravel and a temper that flared at the smallest provocation. He had been watching her all week, his eyes narrow, his remarks always laced with a venom the others didn't receive. Too soft, not aggressive enough. Think you're special, Cruz? She never flinched. She gave him nothing. And that, more than anything, seemed to infuriate him. As the sun climbed higher, fatigue set in. One recruit stumbled during a drill, his bayonet strike barely grazing the target. He wobbled, knees buckling under exhaustion. Elena saw it instantly, the way his balance faltered, the way his eyes rolled slightly from heat. Without thinking, she stepped in, steadying him with one hand on his shoulder. "You're overheating," she said quietly, guiding him upright. "Breathe through your nose. Slow." It was instinct. The medic in her never shut off. That was when it happened. A blur of motion. A boot cutting across her peripheral vision. The impact exploded against her temple with a crack that made her vision stutter white. Pain radiated through her skull as she staggered sideways, one hand flying to her head. Warmth spread across her fingertips, blood already dripping down her cheek. Gasps broke across the field. The recruits froze mid-motion, bayonets hovering in the air. The silence was louder than any shout. Elena's body swayed, her equilibrium thrown into chaos, but she refused to collapse. Gritting her teeth, she straightened slowly, forcing her legs to lock beneath her. She dragged her hand away from the wound, smearing blood across her jaw. Her eyes locked on Staff Sergeant Rollins. He stood there, boots still planted firmly in the dirt, chest heaving as if daring her to react. His smirk was faint, but it carried an unmistakable challenge. The message was clear. You don't belong here. Stay down. Elena didn't blink. I'm fine, she said, her voice low, steady. It wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the recruits who were watching with wide eyes, caught between fear and outrage. The field seemed suspended in time. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the hot wind whispering across the training ground. Rollins shifted, as if satisfied. But the stillness was broken by the sharp squawk of a radio. A lieutenant, pale-faced and frantic, had witnessed everything. His voice cut through the tension, urgent and clipped. "We've got a situation. I repeat, incident at bayonet course. Immediate response required." The words traveled faster than the wind. Minutes later, the grinding sound of engines echoed from the gates. 3 dark SUVs rolled onto the field, tires kicking up clouds of dust. Every recruit snapped to attention instinctively, spines rigid, rifles clutched tight. Even the instructors stiffened, though unease flickered across their faces. The doors opened. Out stepped 3 generals, stars gleaming on their collars, expressions carved from stone. Their presence hit harder than the heat. Generals didn't just show up unannounced, not at training yards, not for routine drills. Something had traveled fast up the chain of command. Elena stood motionless, blood still streaking her temple. Her heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. The recruits didn't know it yet, but nothing about this day would be ordinary again. The general's boots hit the gravel like thunder rolling across the training yard. Every recruit instinctively snapped to attention, but the tension was electric raw, unpredictable. The sun blazed down, baking the field further, yet it was nothing compared to the heat that surged in Elena Cruz's chest. She wiped at the blood on her temple, smearing it, trying to steady her pulse, trying to make herself appear less shaken than she felt. For a split second, the instructors dared to hope. Perhaps the higher-ups wouldn't notice. Perhaps, in the chaos of morning drills, this incident would slide into obscurity. Rollins' smirk returned, faint but defiant. "She's tough," he muttered under his breath to a subordinate. "Let's see how long it lasts under pressure." But the SUVs had arrived precisely on time. From the back seat of the first vehicle, a general with a square jaw and thin, hawk-like eyes stepped out. His stare swept over the yard, as though cutting through every uniform, every footstep, every fear. 2 more followed, each with their own aura of authority, their silence a weapon sharper than any bayonet. The lieutenant who had radioed them ran up, panting, fumbling with his notepad. "Generals, this is Sergeant Elena Cruz," he said, voice shaking as he gestured toward her. She was assaulted. Harris, the first general, didn't bother with greetings. His eyes, hard and cold, locked on Rollins. "Explain." His voice didn't carry anger. It carried judgment. And judgment in the army was heavier than artillery. Rollins shifted, suddenly aware of the gulf between him and the 3 stars before him. "Sir, I was testing her resolve," he said, voice tight, faltering. "Training, discipline. Harris's hand shot up, cutting him off. "Discipline does not come from cowardice or violence masquerading as instruction." Who authorized the strike? The field had gone deathly silent. The recruits froze mid-step, unsure if breathing was allowed. Some stared at Elena, admiration flickering in their eyes. Others could only stare at Rollins, seeing his authority crumble in real time. Elena's head throbbed, but she refused to stagger. Her pulse raced, not from pain, but from the validation that finally, someone higher up was acknowledging the injustice. She had survived combat zones where bombs exploded inches from her, where men she loved were dying, but this was different. This was a battle she hadn't asked for, and yet here she stood. "Report everything you saw," Harris said, turning to the lieutenant. "Every detail, every moment." The lieutenant's voice was shaky, but precise as he recounted what he had witnessed. The stumble of the recruit, Elena stepping in, Rollins' kick. Each word seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the dusty ground. The generals conferred briefly among themselves, nodding in measured silence. Then the second general, a woman with tightly pulled hair and eyes that missed nothing, approached Elena. "Sergeant Cruz," she said, tone firm but not unkind. "Step forward." Elena complied, standing upright despite the ache in her skull. She did not flinch under the gaze of 3 stars. She did not bow. She did not apologize. She simply stated what had happened, clearly, concisely, without embellishment. Rollins' jaw tightened as her words filled the air. His hands twitched at his sides, and for a moment he looked smaller than any recruit in the yard. Humility or fear was unfamiliar to him, and it showed. Meanwhile, the third general, a man known for his procedural rigor, gestured to a group of aides who quickly began snapping photos and taking notes. "Document everything? We need eyewitness accounts from every trainee," he said, "and every instructor. Nothing is to be ignored." For the recruits, the atmosphere was surreal. Just hours earlier, they had been enduring what they believed was normal hazing. Now, the people they revered as untouchable leaders were under scrutiny, and the fallout could reshape the very structure of their training program. Elena remained steady. She knew the importance of clarity. She recounted how she had guided the stumbling recruit, how Rollins had struck her, and how the other instructors had not intervened. She did not add personal judgment or anger, just facts. Facts, she knew, were more dangerous to the guilty than any accusation shouted in rage. The generals nodded, listening, absorbing. Harris's eyes, hawkish and relentless, never left Rollins. Finally, he said, "Sergeant, you handled yourself with discipline under pressure. That is noted. The Army expects integrity, even in the face of provocation. You will not be punished for defending a fellow soldier." Elena blinked, fighting a surge of relief. But the relief was short-lived. The field still had dozens of recruits watching, dozens of instructors standing frozen, unsure of their next move. Harris turned his attention back to the offending cadre. "This unit is temporarily suspended," he said. "Every instructor will remain in place for investigation, and no one is to conduct drills without express authorization from headquarters." Effective immediately, gasps rippled across the yard. The recruit's eyes widened in disbelief. Rollins' smirk had vanished, replaced with a pale mask of panic. He opened his mouth, tried to protest, but Harris raised a hand, silencing him. One of the aides approached Elena with a first aid kit, insisting she be treated immediately. She allowed it, but even as the antiseptic burned against her wound, her mind raced. She had survived worse, but now she realized something important. Courage wasn't only about surviving the battlefield. It was also about standing up inside a system built to reward conformity, a system willing to punish strength when it upset the hierarchy. As the generals spoke to other officers, issuing orders, reassessing training methods, Elena noticed the trainees' reactions. Whispers of admiration, awe, even fear began to circulate. She could see young soldiers thinking, maybe standing up works. Maybe it's possible. Meanwhile, Rollins slumped against a fence post, muttering to no one in particular. He knew this was bigger than discipline or a drill gone wrong. He knew he had crossed a line, and that line had been observed by 3 of the most powerful men and women in the Army. Hours passed. The investigation began in earnest. Every recruit, every trainee, every aide was interviewed. Elena answered the same questions multiple times, each time with calm precision. Her recollection never faltered. Each answer added weight to the mounting evidence against Rollins and the instructors who had allowed the environment of fear to fester. By late afternoon, the mood had shifted entirely. The training yard, once a theater of control and intimidation, felt different. The air was still tense, but respect for Elena had replaced fear. Recruits whispered among themselves, admiration clear in their eyes. She had become a symbol not by design, but by circumstance. That night, as the sun set in blazing gold behind the trees lining the field, Elena finally sat alone in the medical tent, the sting of antiseptic fading. Her head throbbed in sync, with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She thought about the day, the kick, the arrival of the generals, the way authority could shift in an instant. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a quiet, private smile. Today had been more than survival. Today had been a statement. And while the battle wasn't over, she knew the army had just been reminded that courage, truth, and integrity could never be ignored. The following morning, Fort Benning felt different. The sun still blazed over the training yard, but the air was tense, taut like a drawn bowstring. Word had spread overnight. 3 generals had personally intervened, an event that would be whispered for years in barracks and mess halls. Recruits moved with quiet urgency, their usual banter stifled. Even the seasoned instructors avoided eye contact, their confidence cracked by the unmistakable weight of authority that had descended on their unit. Elena arrived early, uniform pressed and neat, despite the lingering ache in her temple. She had slept fitfully, haunted not by the kick itself, but by what might follow. She knew the army didn't forgive recklessness, and yet she also knew she had done nothing wrong. That certainty was her shield as she walked across the dust-scorched field toward the administrative tents within. Generals and investigators were waiting. Inside the tents, the atmosphere was sterile, yet charged. Clipboards clicked, pens scribbled furiously, and voices rose and fell with controlled intensity. Every detail of yesterday's events was under scrutiny. The sequence of drills, the interaction between recruits, Rollins' role, the timeline of injuries. Elena found herself seated across from an aide who meticulously recorded her account. The man's expression was earnest, his eyes darting occasionally toward the generals, as if confirming they were absorbing every word. "Start from the beginning," the aide said, voice neutral. Elena took a deep breath. The bayonet drills began at 0800. Heat was extreme. One recruit, Private Stanton, stumbled during the thrust sequence. I stepped in to stabilize him. Sergeant Rollins then struck me in the head with his boot, without warning or instruction. I stumbled, but did not fall. The other instructors did not intervene. That is the sequence as it happened. She didn't embellish. She didn't soften her words. Precision was her weapon. Each syllable carried weight, and she knew it. The generals listened quietly, seated in a row, eyes narrowing as they absorbed the testimony. Harris's hawkish gaze fixed on Rollins, who had been brought into the tent, standing rigid with his jaw tight. Rollins tried to maintain an air of authority, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching like birds trapped in a cage. "This isn't a matter of personal offense," Harris finally said, voice low but deadly. "It is a matter of command integrity and discipline. Explain why a senior instructor felt it necessary to strike a decorated soldier while on duty." Rollins hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Sir, it was meant to motivate, to test resilience." His voice faltered. "Discipline. Discipline does not come from cowardice," Harris cut in sharply. "It comes from training, from respect, from earned authority. And your methods reflect none of these principles. You have violated the code of conduct." Full stop. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of Harris' words sank in. Even the recruits, watching from the adjacent observation area, could feel the tension. They weren't just hearing a reprimand, they were witnessing the dismantling of a culture that had been normalized in their unit for years. Elena remained seated, her posture rigid, blood still faintly staining the side of her face. The ache had dulled to a persistent thrum, a reminder of the kick that had set everything into motion. Yet inside, she felt a calm she hadn't expected. Truth, she realized, was more powerful than fear. The investigation moved forward methodically. Every recruit, every aide, and every instructor was interviewed. Elena provided the same testimony multiple times, never wavering. She answered questions about timing, spacing, physical positions, and emotional responses. Every detail reinforced the reality of the incident, leaving little room for misinterpretation or dismissal. Meanwhile, the internal repercussions began to unfold. Officers were called into private meetings. Rollins was placed under temporary suspension, restricted from all training activities. Other instructors faced scrutiny for failing to intervene, creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had allowed abuse to persist unchecked. The general's intervention wasn't just symbolic, it was procedural, judicial, and deliberate. Outside the tents, recruits whispered fervently. Elena's presence was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. She had become a figure of quiet authority, someone who had challenged the entrenched hierarchy and emerged unbroken. Private Stanton, whose stumble had sparked the incident, approached her cautiously. "Sergeant?" "Thank you," he said, voice barely audible over the breeze. "If you hadn't stood up." Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," she said softly. "This isn't about you. It's about the system realizing it has to do better." Hours passed, and the interrogation extended. Generals rotated through the tent, each assessing the unfolding investigation with their own intensity. Elena answered questions about her training philosophy, her approach to stress, and her observations of the unit culture. Her recollections were precise, measured, and unwavering. The investigators noted the consistency, recording everything in their meticulous reports. At one point, the third general, a woman known for her analytical mind, leaned forward. "Sergeant Cruz," she said, "how do you suggest we prevent incidents like this in the future?" Elena considered briefly. "Clear accountability," she said finally. "Every instructor should be observed regularly, not just in drills, but in interactions with trainees. Hazing or physical intimidation must be immediately reported. The chain of command has to act quickly when standards are violated. Respect has to be part of training, not fear." Her answer resonated. The generals exchanged glances. They had seen firsthand the cost of unchecked authority and knew her solution carried both insight and practicality. As the sun began to dip behind the tall pines lining the field, the generals gathered to issue preliminary orders. Training programs would be suspended, internal reviews conducted, and the unit placed under oversight until corrective measures were fully implemented. Harris turned to Elena. "Your composure under pressure is noted," he said. "You've set a standard for all soldiers, not just within this unit, but across Fort Benning. That is commendable." Elena nodded, her expression neutral. Praise was unnecessary. Recognition wasn't the goal. Safety, fairness, and integrity were. And today, she had carved a small path toward all three. By late afternoon, the field had emptied, but the impact lingered. Recruits moved differently, their glances more thoughtful, their conversations subdued. The instructors who remained were visibly shaken. For the first time, fear of accountability had outweighed the fear of the drill itself. The lesson, harsh and clear, was about to ripple through the entire chain of command. Alone in the medical tent that evening, Elena reflected on the day. The kick, the generals, the investigation, it was overwhelming, but also affirming. She had survived not only the physical blow, but the deeper cultural inertia that allowed such acts to continue. Courage, she realized, wasn't only about surviving combat. It was about standing firm, demanding accountability, and refusing to allow injustice to pass unnoticed. When she finally removed her uniform and washed the blood from her temple, the reflection staring back at her was familiar but altered. Strength, integrity, and resilience were written into her features in ways no combat injury ever could. She was a soldier, yes, but also a catalyst, a reminder that even in the most rigid structures, one voice of truth could ripple outward and force change. And in that quiet tent, as shadows stretched across the canvas walls, Elena understood that the battle was far from over, but for the first time, she had hope. The morning at Fort Benning carried a different weight. The air, usually buzzing with the rhythm of drills and shouted orders, felt thick with anticipation and unease. The events of the previous day, the kick, the arrival of 3 generals, the immediate suspension of the unit, had rippled through every corner of the base. Whispers traveled faster than boots on the gravel. Even the birds seemed to hesitate before taking flight. Alana Cruz arrived early, moving with her usual calm precision, though every step reminded her of the throb in her temple. Yesterday's events had been chaotic, intense, and yet strangely affirming. For the first time in her career, she realized the army was capable of holding its own ranks accountable. But affirmation didn't erase the weight she carried, the responsibility of being a living symbol, a soldier who had forced change. Inside the administrative tents, the generals and their aides had already convened. The unit's senior officers were present, faces pale, eyes darting nervously. Every instruction, every comment, every reaction was now under scrutiny. Elena observed silently as Harris, the hawkish general, reviewed the preliminary reports. His face was an unreadable mask, yet there was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes, the kind that made even seasoned officers uneasy. The room's atmosphere was taut, every breath heavy with unspoken consequences. Harris finally addressed the gathered instructors. "Your conduct yesterday was unacceptable," he said, voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority. "And it represents a systemic failure that will be corrected immediately." Rollins, seated stiffly in a corner, tried to maintain composure, but his hands betrayed him, clenched tight in his lap, trembling slightly. The reality had begun to dawn. The chain of command could no longer protect arrogance or cruelty. Harris gestured to Elena. "Sergeant Cruz has provided a detailed account, which has been corroborated by multiple witnesses. Her professionalism under pressure has exposed a failure within this unit. Sergeant, you will assist in guiding corrective measures." Alana's throat tightened slightly. She wasn't accustomed to praise, but she had also learned early that leadership often required stepping into discomfort. She nodded, voice steady. "Understood, sir." The generals then turned to the broader investigation. Every trainee who had been present during the drill was questioned individually. Their statements painted a consistent picture: intimidation disguised as training, fear normalized as discipline, and instructors who failed to intervene. The narrative was damning, yet precise. Elena's calm and factual testimony acted as the backbone of the investigation, giving credibility to every account. One young recruit, barely out of basic training, admitted to feeling fear daily, fearful not just of drills, but of retaliation if they spoke up. Elena's eyes softened as she listened. She understood all too well the weight of fear in hierarchical systems. Silence, compliance, and intimidation often masked incompetence or cruelty. She had lived that reality. Meanwhile, Rollins attempted to defend his actions, his words awkward and unconvincing. I was testing her resilience, building toughness." His voice faltered as Harris cut him off. "You cannot instill toughness through cowardice and cruelty. That is not leadership. That is failure, and it will not be tolerated." The generals methodically went through each instructor, holding them accountable for allowing the toxic culture to persist. Some protested, claiming the system required harshness to mold effective soldiers. Harris's reply was concise: "Respect and accountability are non-negotiable. Physical abuse disguised as motivation is not acceptable under any circumstance. Elena observed the proceedings with a mixture of calm and vigilance. Each rebuke, each acknowledgement of wrongdoing, reinforced the importance of what had begun the previous day. The unit, once a fortress of intimidation, was now exposed to scrutiny that would reshape its core principles. Between interviews, Elena found brief moments to speak quietly with some recruits. Private Stanton, the young soldier whose stumble had inadvertently sparked the investigation, approached her. "Sergeant Cruz, do you think things will really change?" he asked, voice low, eyes searching. Elena placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "They have to," she replied softly. "If change doesn't happen here, it can happen anywhere. And it starts with people being willing to speak the truth. You did that by being honest yesterday. Hours passed. Reports were compiled, corroborated, and reviewed. The generals and their aides worked with meticulous efficiency, understanding the broader implications of what had been uncovered. Leadership was being tested, not by combat, but by the very integrity of its members. In the middle of the afternoon, Harris called a private meeting with Elena. "Sergeant," he said, voice measured, "you have done more than endure a single act of cruelty. You have exposed systemic failure. Your composure and clarity have set an example for every soldier here. What you did takes courage and wisdom." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. Praise had never been her goal. She thought instead of the young soldiers who had watched silently, absorbing the lessons of yesterday and today. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "But the credit belongs to the witnesses who spoke up, and to the recruits who endured it." The generals nodded, understanding her restraint. Harris leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Your insight will guide corrective measures. We will restructure training protocols, implement stricter oversight, and ensure accountability is immediate. Hazing, intimidation, and unmonitored instruction will no longer be tolerated." As the day waned, Elena felt a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. She had survived more than a physical assault. She had survived the fear and inertia of a system resistant to change. Her role was not only to witness, but to shape. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her, but she bore it with steady resolve. Outside the tent, the atmosphere of the base had shifted. Recruits moved with a newfound awareness, and even junior officers carried themselves differently, mindful that actions would be observed and recorded. Elena noticed subtle gestures of respect, a nod, a moment of eye contact acknowledging her presence and the integrity she embodied. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the field, Elena returned to the medical tent. The ache in her head had become a dull thrum, a reminder of the physical and symbolic kick that had ignited the chain of events. She cleaned her wound and reflected on the day. Each decision, each action, each testimony had reinforced a critical truth. Courage, integrity, and accountability could pierce even the most rigid systems. In the quiet of the tent, Elena allowed herself a small smile. The battle was far from over, but she had made a difference. She had stood firm when others had faltered, and the army had been forced to acknowledge its failings. For the first time in a long while, Elena felt a flicker of hope. The work ahead would be challenging, but the foundations of change had been laid. Leadership, integrity, and resilience were no longer abstract ideals. They were now lived realities, visible to every recruit, every officer, every soldier who had witnessed the events. And as night fell over Fort Benning, the stars above seemed to mirror the authority in the field below. The generals had come, the system had been shaken, and a single soldier's courage had begun to reshape the future of an entire unit. By the next morning, Fort Benning had transformed. The usual cadence of drills and shouted commands persisted, but there was a perceptible tension in the air, a quiet alertness that hadn't existed before. Recruits moved carefully, exchanging cautious glances, aware that yesterday's events were no longer isolated. The word of the general's intervention had spread like wildfire. Officers and trainees alike were acutely aware that accountability was no longer optional. Elena Cruz stepped onto the training grounds with measured confidence. Despite the lingering ache in her temple, she moved with her familiar precision, scanning the field as if every footstep, every glance, every posture mattered. And it did. Her presence carried weight, now unspoken but undeniable. She had become a symbol, a living testament to courage and integrity. Trainees whispered her name softly as she passed, admiration laced with awe. Even Private Stanton, whose stumble had inadvertently set the chain of events in motion, nodded respectfully, a flicker of inspiration in his eyes. Inside the administrative tents, the generals and their aides were fully engaged. The previous day's reports had been expanded with testimonies from all present personnel, and preliminary disciplinary recommendations were under review. The room was tense, filled with the quiet hum of pens scratching paper, the clicking of clipboards, and the occasional soft question from an aide. Every officer present understood that systemic failure had been exposed, and no detail could be overlooked. Harris, the hawkish general, called the senior officers into a private briefing. The room contracted with the weight of his gaze. "This is not simply a disciplinary matter," he began. "It is a systemic issue that cannot be ignored. Training protocols will be restructured, and all instructors are under review. The culture that allowed intimidation to persist unchecked ends now." Rollins, seated in a corner, absorbed the words with a pale, rigid expression. He realized fully for the first time that his career, his authority, and his reputation were all at risk. Every instinct he had relied upon, the intimidation, the perceived dominance, was now meaningless under scrutiny. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Meanwhile, Elena was called into a separate meeting with the investigative team. The questions this time were more probing. Her observations of the instructor's broader behavior, the patterns she had noticed over weeks, even months. She recounted incidents that had previously seemed minor, now cast in the harsh light of accountability. Hazing rituals disguised as discipline, verbal intimidation masked as instruction, and negligence when recruits were in danger. All were catalogued meticulously. Her testimony was calm, precise, and unflinching. Every word carried weight, not because of volume, but because of accuracy. The aides documented each statement, aware that Helena's clarity was shaping the future of the unit. Even the generals occasionally leaned in, listening intently to her account. Outside, recruits began to absorb the lessons indirectly, observing the investigations, the inquiries, and the general's meticulous oversight. They understood that courage, integrity, and accountability could pierce even entrenched systems. Fear was no longer the only currency in this unit. During a brief break, Elena found Private Stanton and a few other trainees gathered quietly near the edge of the field. "Do you think things will actually change?" one of them asked, voice low, eyes cautious. Elena looked at each of them in turn. "They have to," she replied. "If change doesn't happen here, it can't happen anywhere. You all have to remember that speaking the truth is a responsibility. You did nothing wrong yesterday. This is about making the system accountable." Her words carried a mixture of authority and reassurance. For the young soldiers, they were both guidance and inspiration. They understood that integrity required courage, and that the courage to act might be uncomfortable, but ultimately transformative. The day unfolded with a series of interviews, assessments, and formal statements. Rollins and the other instructors were questioned repeatedly, their responses scrutinized against the accounts of recruits and Elena. The pressure mounted visibly. Their previous authority crumbled as contradictions in their narratives emerged. Even minor inconsistencies were magnified under the general's watchful eyes. By afternoon, The preliminary findings were compiled into a report for higher command. It was damning. Rollins' actions had violated multiple regulations, and the environment within the unit had fostered fear rather than discipline. The generals deliberated over appropriate consequences, weighing the balance between corrective action and maintaining operational readiness. Harris finally spoke to the assembled officers. "The findings are clear," he said. "Actions will be taken immediately. Leadership that abuses authority will be removed, and programs that perpetuate fear will be restructured. Sergeant Cruz will assist in guiding the corrective measures. Her conduct sets the standard for all soldiers." Elena listened, her face composed, but inside, she felt the familiar surge of responsibility. Change was underway, but implementation would require vigilance, persistence, and continual reinforcement. Leadership was more than issuing orders. It was cultivating an environment of respect and accountability. Later, she returned to the medical tent to assess her head injury. The pain had dulled to a rhythmic throb, a reminder of the kick that had started it all. She applied antiseptic and bandages carefully, reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. This wasn't merely about physical resilience. It was about mental fortitude, moral courage, and the willingness to challenge injustice. Her thoughts wandered to the recruits who had witnessed her endurance. Many had likely been inspired, others perhaps intimidated by the magnitude of the general's intervention. Either way, a seed had been planted, a recognition that fairness and integrity were not negotiable, even in hierarchical structures designed to demand obedience. Even as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the base, the energy on the field remained altered. Recruits moved with a renewed awareness. Instructors spoke with measured caution, and the atmosphere carried a quiet tension. Every action was now observed, every word weighed. Accountability was no longer theoretical, it was immediate. Elena spent the evening reviewing notes, drafting suggestions for training reforms, and organizing her thoughts for the next day. She drafted detailed recommendations, frequent oversight of instructors, mandatory reporting of any physical or verbal intimidation, and structured mentorship programs emphasizing respect and professionalism. Each proposal was grounded in both practicality and principle, informed by her first-hand experience in combat and in the field. As night fell, she finally stepped outside. The stars shone bright above the training grounds, distant yet immutable. She inhaled the cool evening air, reflecting on the paradox of her situation. One violent act, a single moment of cruelty, had unleashed a cascade of accountability, scrutiny, and reform. What had seemed like a personal assault had revealed systemic flaws and sparked the beginning of lasting change. Elena understood that the work was far from over. The culture of fear she had exposed would not vanish overnight. Some officers would resist, some recruits might relapse into old habits, and challenges would continue to arise. But for the first time, the Army had been forced to recognize that courage, integrity, and accountability were inseparable from leadership. And as she closed the medical tent for the night, Elena allowed herself a brief, private smile. The kick had hurt, but its consequences had set something far more significant into motion. She had endured, witnessed, and now guided the unfolding transformation. Courage was contagious, and in the quiet of the Fort Benning night, that lesson had begun to take root. The days following the investigation carried a sense of controlled urgency. Fort Benning's training yard had not returned to its usual rhythm. Instead, a quiet attentiveness hung over the base. Recruits and officers alike moved cautiously, their actions and words weighed carefully under the new scrutiny. For the first time, the culture of fear that had long dictated behavior in the unit was being dismantled piece by piece. Elena Cruz arrived early, as always, her uniform immaculate, despite the lingering aches and bruises from the kick that had sparked the entire investigation. The generals had made it clear. Her role was now part of the unit's reform. She would guide training, ensure accountability, and serve as a visible example of integrity. It was a responsibility she did not seek, but had accepted with quiet resolve. Her first task was observing and mentoring the junior instructors who remained. Some had expressed remorse, others silent apprehension. Elena approached each one with a mixture of professionalism and firmness. She did not berate. She did not reward. She demonstrated. She showed them how to instruct with authority, tempered by respect, how to correct errors without intimidation, how to challenge recruits while maintaining their dignity. In a quiet corner of the training yard, she worked with Private Stanton and several others. "Focus on your posture," she said, adjusting the angle of a trainee's bayonet. "Control comes from discipline, not brute force. Understand the mechanics, internalize them, and the rest will follow." Her hands guided, her voice remained steady, and her presence commanded attention. The instructors watched closely, some reluctantly, others with curiosity. Rollins, meanwhile, was confined to administrative oversight, removed from direct instruction. He observed Elena's methods with a mixture of skepticism and disbelief. "This is his. Too soft," he muttered to himself, unaware that his words carried no weight in the presence of established authority. The generals had made their position clear. Intimidation had no place in training, and results would now be measured by skill, discipline, and respect, not fear. Over the next week, structured oversight began. Every drill was monitored, every interaction documented. Mistakes were corrected immediately, but without punishment or humiliation. Recruits began to notice the change, the subtle shift in tone and approach. They spoke quietly among themselves, unsure whether this was temporary or a lasting transformation. Elena overheard a whisper. "She's different. She doesn't scare you. She just makes you better." She allowed herself a small nod, knowing the comment captured the essence of the reform she was helping to implement. The generals continued to visit, assessing the changes firsthand. Harris scrutinized every move, occasionally pausing to ask questions, evaluating how authority was exercised and how recruits responded. Elena found herself explaining rationale, demonstrating techniques, and offering insights based on her combat experience. The generals listened, nodding occasionally, impressed by her clarity and composure. They understood that leadership was not merely instructing. It was inspiring, modeling, and holding oneself accountable. Instructors who had once relied on fear began to adjust. Some struggled more than others, their old habits ingrained through years of unchecked authority. Elena worked closely with them, often speaking privately, offering guidance with patience. "Leadership is measured in respect earned, not fear instilled," she told Rollins' replacement quietly, voice firm but not condescending. "The recruits need to trust you, not dread you. They will rise to your standards if you rise to yours." The cultural shift was subtle but perceptible. Recruits began taking more initiative, asking questions and assisting one another without fear of reprimand. The hum of collaboration replaced the tense defensive energy that had previously dominated. Elena observed these changes with satisfaction, noting that transformation required more than policy. It required daily reinforcement and consistency. During one afternoon drill, a particularly difficult exercise tested endurance and teamwork. Normally, instructors would shout, berate, or punish minor mistakes. Today, Elena walked alongside recruits, correcting posture, demonstrating technique, and offering encouragement. She noticed Private Stanton faltering mid-strike and stepped in immediately. "Adjust your stance," she said. "You've got the control. Now apply it. Focus." His next strike was precise, and he glanced at her with a small, grateful smile. Around them, other recruits followed suit, motivated by the visible leadership Elena embodied. Meanwhile, administrative reviews continued. Reports from the field, interviews with recruits, and direct observations were compiled meticulously. The generals evaluated the cumulative effects of the reforms and noted areas needing further adjustment. Harris called a meeting with Elena privately. "Sergeant Cruz," he said, voice measured, "the unit is already responding positively. Your guidance is having a tangible effect. This is a rare achievement. Changing culture is far more difficult than any combat operation." Elena nodded, recognizing the truth of his words. Combat had tested her physical endurance and mental acuity, but changing human behavior required a different kind of resilience, one that demanded patience, clarity, and unwavering principles. She was exhausted, but resolute. The work was far from over, but measurable progress had been made. Over the next several days, the morale of the unit noticeably improved. Recruits reported feeling safer, instructors were more thoughtful, and the culture of intimidation dissipated further. Even the skeptical instructors began to observe the benefits: better performance, fewer mistakes under stress, and more cohesive teamwork. Elena's influence became evident not only in the recruits' conduct, but in the subtle shift of confidence among the instructors themselves. During breaks, recruits approached Elena with quiet gratitude. "Sergeant," one said, "we've never had a training environment like this before. It's easier to focus, easier to learn." Another added, "You make us want to get it right, not just avoid punishment." Elena acknowledged them with a nod, understanding that her presence was as much symbolic as practical. She didn't seek praise. She sought change. And that change was beginning to take root. As evening approached, Elena returned to the medical tent to tend to lingering aches and reflect. The sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the field, and the cooling air carried the faint scent of pine and dirt. She sat quietly, reviewing notes and mentally mapping the progress made so far. Every adjustment, every reinforcement, every measured correction contributed to a larger transformation. What had begun as a personal ordeal being struck in the head by Rollins had evolved into a movement of accountability and leadership reform. Even as fatigue settled in, Elena felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. Change was not complete, but it was no longer a theoretical concept. The foundations of a new training culture were firmly in place: respect, accountability, and integrity. She had guided not only the recruits, but also the instructors, reshaping the environment into one where fear was no longer a motivator. Later, as the base lights flickered on and the training yard emptied, Elena took a long, quiet walk along the perimeter. The stars glimmered above, distant yet steady, much like the principles she was striving to instill. Courage, accountability, and leadership were not abstract ideals. They were tangible, actionable, and essential. And for the first time in her career, she felt the profound impact of her presence. One act of defiance against cruelty had evolved into a movement of cultural transformation, and the effects would ripple far beyond this unit. Elena understood that vigilance would be necessary. Old habits die hard, and the resistance to change would continue in subtle ways. Yet, with consistent effort, mentorship, and unwavering enforcement of accountability, the culture could solidify into one of integrity and resilience. For the recruits, for the instructors, and for the Army as a whole, this was the beginning of something lasting. And in the quiet of the Fort Benning night, Elena felt a rare sense of peace. She had endured, she had guided, and she had inspired. The work ahead would demand endurance and vigilance, but for the first time, she saw the tangible fruits of courage, not just survival, as shaping the world around her. By the beginning of the following week, the atmosphere at Fort Benning had shifted entirely. The training yard no longer vibrated with tension alone. There was a measured energy, a rhythm of controlled excellence replacing fear-driven obedience. Recruits moved with purpose, executing drills with precision and confidence, guided by instructors whose methods had transformed under Elena Cruz's careful mentorship. The generals continued to monitor the unit, but their visits became less about immediate discipline and more about assessing sustained change. Harris, ever vigilant, made it clear that this transformation was expected to be lasting, and he looked to Elena as the key catalyst. Her presence alone had begun to reshape the culture, proving that leadership could inspire without intimidation. Elena began each morning with a review of the day's drills, briefing both instructors and trainees. She emphasized clarity, consistency, and accountability, ensuring that every movement, every correction, and every instruction reinforced respect rather than fear. She observed, corrected, and demonstrated, modeling the kind of leadership she had learned in combat zones where precision, discipline, and integrity were inseparable from survival. One of the instructors, who had initially struggled to adapt, approached her hesitantly during a break. "Sergeant Cruz, I didn't think this would work. I've been training soldiers this way for 15 years, and I never considered that respect could actually make them perform better." His voice carried a mix of disbelief and cautious admiration. Elena nodded. Leadership is not about instilling fear. It's about setting standards and guiding people to meet them. Fear may produce compliance, but respect produces excellence, and that excellence lasts long after you leave the room. The instructor absorbed her words, nodding slowly. Others, who had resisted her guidance initially, began to emulate her methods. Where once harsh words and physical intimidation had dominated, there was now measured guidance, constructive feedback, and encouragement. A difference was tangible. Even the most skeptical trainees noticed it, their confidence growing with every exercise. During one particularly grueling afternoon drill, a complex obstacle course designed to test endurance, strategy, and teamwork, Elena moved among the recruits, offering corrections and encouragement. She noticed a group struggling with synchronization and immediately intervened. "Focus on timing," she instructed. "One step, one motion. Watch your partner. Trust each other. That's how teams survive under pressure." The recruits responded, adjusting their pace, communicating effectively, and completing the sequence with precision. Elena's eyes scanned the field, noting the subtle shift in posture, the newfound determination in their movements. Where fear had once frozen them, understanding and respect now empowered them. Meanwhile, administrative oversight continued, but the emphasis had shifted. Reports were now less about punishment and more about tracking progress, identifying areas for further reinforcement, and ensuring that the cultural reforms were embedding themselves within the unit. The generals observed the changes closely, nodding at the visible improvements in both performance and morale. One evening, Harris called Elena into his temporary office on the field. The late sunlight streamed across stacks of reports, casting long shadows that mirrored the weight of the work accomplished. "Sergeant Cruz," he began, his voice unusually measured, "the impact you've had is remarkable. Not only are the trainees performing at a higher level, but the instructors are also adapting in ways I didn't think possible. Your leadership is exemplary." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. Praise was secondary to results. "Thank you, sir." The credit belongs to the trainees as much as the instructors. They've responded to the opportunity to perform without fear. The culture encouraged them to excel rather than simply endure. Harris studied her, recognizing her rare combination of discipline, calm authority, and empathy. "You've demonstrated what many fail to grasp. Leadership isn't about control, it's about influence. And you've influenced a whole unit in less than a week. That's extraordinary." Word of Elena's influence had also begun to spread among the recruits. Private Stanton, now confident and composed, approached her with a question during an evening briefing. "Sergeant, How did you stay so calm when it all started? When Rollin struck you, and everything went crazy? Elena paused, reflecting. I've seen worse on the battlefield, she replied quietly. But it wasn't just about enduring the strike. It was about what came after, the choice to act, to speak the truth, and to demand accountability. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. The recruit nodded, absorbing her words. Around them, others watched quietly, internalizing the lesson without realizing the depth of its impact. Elena's words were not just instruction. They were a blueprint for resilience, integrity, and leadership. By midweek, the changes were undeniable. Drills ran smoothly, injuries were minimized, and communication among recruits improved dramatically. Team exercises, once plagued by fear-induced hesitation, now showcased coordination, confidence, and initiative. The instructors, under Elena's guidance, had transformed from authoritarian figures to mentors, modeling precision, patience, and accountability. The generals made another unannounced visit, observing both training and administrative processes. Their satisfaction was evident, though restrained by protocol. Harris pulled Elena aside privately afterward. You've turned what could have been a disaster into a model of reform, he said. It's rare that one individual can catalyze such swift and meaningful change. Elena allowed herself a moment of reflection. The kick, the abuse, and the immediate intervention of the generals had set in motion a chain of events that had reshaped the unit. Her role had evolved from survivor to mentor, from participant to catalyst, and from soldier to leader. Each action, each correction, each moment of guidance had reinforced the principles of accountability, respect, and integrity. That evening, she walked alone through the training yard. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Shadows stretched across the field, mingling with the last rays of sunlight. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to breathe, to reflect on the journey so far. The physical pain from the kick had faded to a dull memory, but its significance remained. It had been the spark that ignited change, and the transformation she witnessed now was the fire it had kindled. She thought of the recruits, their initial fear, their confusion, and now their growing confidence. She thought of the instructors, their resistance, hesitation, and now their adaptation to a new model of leadership. And she thought of the army itself, the capacity for self-correction, the power of accountability, and the potential for individuals to catalyze systemic change. As night fell, the stars appeared above the training grounds, distant yet constant. Elena's reflection in the dim light of the tent reminded her that the work was ongoing. Vigilance would always be required, resistance would surface in subtle ways, and challenges would persist. But for the first time, she saw the possibility of lasting transformation. Courage, integrity, and leadership had been tested, and they had endured. And in that enduring strength, Elena Cruz found the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her actions had left an indelible mark on the unit, the recruits, and the culture itself. The sun rose over Fort Benning with a crisp clarity that mirrored the transformation within the unit. The air carried purpose, discipline, and focus, but not fear. Recruits moved with confidence, executing drills and exercises with precision, their eyes sharp and alert. The change was palpable each step, each gesture, and each command reflecting a culture reshaped by accountability and leadership. Elena Cruz stepped onto the field with measured calm, her uniform impeccable, her presence commanding, but not intimidating. She had become more than a soldier or a survivor. She had become a catalyst, a living symbol of integrity, courage, and reform. Trainees and instructors alike paused as she passed, acknowledging not just her authority, but the transformation she embodied. The generals were scheduled for an unannounced inspection that morning, and the atmosphere buzzed with quiet tension. Yet this time, the nervous energy was different. Recruits were confident, instructors prepared, and Elena moved through the yard as a steady anchor. She oversaw team drills, observed technique, and offered corrections with clarity and composure. Her influence was evident. Where fear had once dictated behavior, respect and accountability now guided performance. Harris, flanked by his aides, arrived first. His hawkish eyes swept the field, noting the precision, the discipline, and the evident cohesion among the trainees. The difference from his initial visit days ago was stark. He observed recruits communicating clearly, assisting one another, and executing drills without hesitation. Instructors provided guidance rather than intimidation. Corrections came with explanation rather than punishment. The entire unit operated like a well-oiled machine, resilient, cohesive, and effective. Elena approached Harris as he walked the field. "Sergeant Cruz," he said, voice measured but approving, "the transformation is remarkable. Your guidance has clearly instilled both discipline and confidence. The unit has exceeded expectations." She nodded, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Thank you, sir. The recruits and instructors have risen to the opportunity. The structure supports the change, but they have internalized it. That's what makes it sustainable." The second general, the analytical woman with tightly pulled hair, walked alongside Harris. She nodded at Elena, her expression thoughtful. "Leadership is rarely this effective without coercion. You've proven that respect can motivate as effectively, sometimes more so than fear." Helena's eyes scanned the training yard. Each recruit, each instructor, and each movement told the story of a unit reborn. Private Stanton executed a particularly difficult maneuver with perfect timing, his eyes meeting Elena's briefly. She gave a subtle nod of approval. The silent exchange carried more meaning than words. It was the acknowledgement of growth, courage, and resilience. Later, in the administrative tent, the generals convened with the senior officers. Disciplinary actions were formalized. Rollins was relieved of all instructional duties and reassigned pending further review. Other instructors who had allowed a culture of intimidation to persist faced formal reprimands and mandatory retraining. The message was clear. Accountability was absolute, and no rank or tenure exempted anyone from ethical leadership. Elena observed the proceedings quietly. She had expected some resistance, but the clarity and decisiveness of the generals ensured the consequences were unambiguous. The unit's culture had shifted fundamentally. Fear no longer dictated behavior, and integrity was the foundation upon which all future training would be built. Throughout the afternoon, she led workshops for the remaining instructors, demonstrating techniques that balanced authority with respect. She emphasized observation, guidance, and constructive correction. Instructors practiced under her watchful eye, gradually internalizing her methods. Where resistance had once been visible, competence and confidence now replaced hesitation. The transformation was both cultural and practical. Meanwhile, recruits experienced their own transformation. Exercises that had previously induced panic now fostered initiative, communication, and mutual support. Elena moved among them, observing, correcting, and encouraging. Her presence was steady, a constant reminder that excellence and accountability could coexist with respect. As evening approached, the generals made a final visit to witness a capstone exercise, a complex, multi-stage simulation testing leadership, teamwork, and decision-making. The unit executed flawlessly. Commands were clear, coordination seamless, and morale high. Even in simulated high-pressure situations, fear was absent. Confidence, competence, and trust guided every action. Harris approached Elena privately afterward. "Sergeant Cruz," he said, voice carrying rare warmth, "you have accomplished something extraordinary. Not only have you transformed this unit, but you have demonstrated the kind of leadership that reshapes culture. You've set a standard that will be studied and replicated across the army. Elena allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. Praise was not her aim, but recognition of the impact she had created was gratifying. Thank you, sir. It wasn't just me. It was the willingness of the trainees and instructors to adapt. Courage is contagious, and once the first step is taken, change spreads quickly. The generals departed as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a golden glow across the training yard. The transformation was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. Instructors had learned to lead without intimidation. Recruits had learned to act with initiative and confidence, and Elena had solidified her role as both mentor and exemplar. That evening, Elena walked alone across the yard. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of pine and dust, a reminder of both hardship and growth. She reflected on the journey, the kick that had begun it all, the intervention of the generals, the painstaking investigation, and the gradual, deliberate cultural shift. Each step had required courage, resilience, and integrity. Private Stanton approached her quietly, speaking almost reverently. Sergeant Cruz, thank you for showing us how to lead and how to follow with integrity. You've changed everything. Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. The change is real because you all made it possible. Leadership is not about fear. It's about responsibility. Remember that as you continue your journey here and beyond. Later, she returned to her quarters, removing her uniform and cleaning her temple. The ache from the initial kick was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet satisfaction. What had begun as a violent, personal confrontation had catalyzed systemic change. Her role as a catalyst was complete, and the lessons endured beyond the immediate moment. As night fell over Fort Benning, the stars above glimmered steadily, mirroring the principles that had been tested and proven: courage, integrity, and accountability. Elena stood by the window, reflecting on the journey from chaos to transformation. The army had been reminded that leadership was not about fear, but about influence, respect, and unwavering commitment to principle. In that quiet moment, Elena understood that her impact would last far beyond the unit, far beyond Fort Benning. One act of courage, one refusal to remain silent, had reshaped the lives of countless soldiers, established new standards of conduct, and proven that integrity could indeed triumph over intimidation. And in the silence of the night, Elena Cruz allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. The unit had been transformed, justice had been served, and a legacy of leadership, respect, and accountability had been firmly established.